Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I am Ali Raza Fahad. In this video, I will discuss realism. The realist art movement. The realist art movement started in the mid 19th century and lasted until the early 20th century. It developed in France and then spread rapidly throughout the rest of Europe, all the way to Russia and then overseas to the US. The realist art movement began as a reaction to Romanticism, history painting, and the rise of the bourgeois in Europe. In favor of depictions of real life, the realist painters used common laborers and ordinary people in ordinary surroundings engaged in real activities as subjects for their works. This is a realist painting showing ordinary people engaged in real activities in a very common surrounding. Development of literary realism. The roots of literary realism lie in France, where realist writers published works of realism in novels and in serial form in newspaper. Literary realism was a reaction against the romanticism and romantic themes of artificiality. They rejected heroic, adventurous, or unfamiliar subjects. Realist writers show us how even ordinary lives are meaningful and always full of drama. Artists and writers strove for detailed, realistic, and factual descriptions. They try to represent events and social conditions as they actually are without idealization. Literary realism aims to reproduce objective reality and focused on showing everyday quotidian activities and life primarily among the middle or lower class society without romantic idealization or dramatization. According to William Dean Howells, but let the fiction cease to lie about life, let it portray men and women as they are, actuated by the motives and passions in the measure we all know. Realism aims to interpret the actualities of any aspect of life, free from subjective prejudice, idealism, or romantic color. Literary realism stresses the real over the fantastic. Some of these writers were reacting against the Romantic movement, which often stressed nature over culture, the solitary individual against society. Realist writers, unlike the Romantics, like to focus on groups of people. They give us the big picture, a panorama of a village, a city, or a society. The big picture trait suits the novel genre, which is huge and flexible. The earliest realist writers include Henri de Balzac, who infused his writing with complex characters and detailed observations about society. Gustave Flaubert, who established realist narration as we know it today. Literary realism existed in some form in England before the genre was fully defined. Some critics credit the first British novelists like Daniel Defoe and Samuel Richardson as realists because they wrote about issues related to the middle class. The genre developed in parallel with the UK's new middle class, and the authors took the opportunity to echo their interests and concerns. Once realism took shape, novelists like George Eliot, Charles Dickens, George Gissing, Arnold Bennett, and George Moore published great realist novels. Literary realism introduced a new way of writing and a new generation of authors whose influence can still be seen in English literature and American literature to this day. While the preceding Romantic era was also a reaction against the values of the Industrial Revolution, realism was in its turn a reaction to Romanticism. Therefore, it is also derogatorily referred as traditional bourgeois realism. Characteristics of literary realism. Literary realism is all about recreating life in literature, the experienced commonplace. In literary realism, we find objective writing about ordinary characters in ordinary situations, which is tantamount to representing real life, a slice of life. Literary realism is concerned with all aspects of living, the unpleasant and sordid, as well as the pleasant and noble. Diction in literary realist writings is natural vernacular as people talk, not heightened or poetic. Tone may be comic, satiric, or matter of fact. Events in realist writings are usually plausible, a story that could happen in your town. Settings of realist writings are thoroughly familiar to the writer. Realist plots emphasize the norm of daily experience. Realist characters are ordinary people from different classes. These characters are more important than plot and action. Complex ethical choices are often the subject. Characters appear in their real complexity of temperament and motive. They are in reasonable relation to nature, to each other, to their social class, and to their own past. In realist writings, emphasis is on motives more than outward action and incident. Realist writings emphasizes the individual as a whole person rather than concerned with character types. Climax in a realist writing or in a realist story is not a crisis, but just one more unimportant fact. In realist writings, class is important. The novel or a story has traditionally served the interests and aspirations of an insurgent middle class. Readers were attracted to the realists because they saw their own struggles in print. Responsible morality is one of the hallmark of realist writings. This morality is usually intrinsic, relativistic between people and society. Humans in realist writings are in control of their own destiny and are superior to their circumstances. So much detail and description, which build up the reality effect. Realist writing is all about critiquing the social, economic, and political conditions of the world the writers write about. Writers were concerned with the effect of the work on their reader and reader's life, which gives a pragmatic view. In realist writings, we find controlled and limited use of symbolism. They are more descriptive, and there is an excessive use of images instead. Realist writers often write like journalists, and their attention to specific facts and specific details only adds to the sense of verisimilitude in their fictional works. To communicate the whole truth, realist writers tend to use certain techniques like stream of consciousness and impressionism. Types of literary realism. There are a few different types of literary realism, each with its own distinct characteristics. Magical realism. Magical realism is a type of realism that blurs the lines between fantasy and reality. Magical realism portrays the world truthfully, plus adds magical elements that are not found in our reality but are still considered normal in the world the story takes place. 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez is a magical realism novel. Social realism. Social realism is a type of realism that focuses on the lives and living conditions of the working class and the poor. Les Miserables by Victor Hugo is a social novel about class and politics in France. Kitchen sink realism. Kitchen sink realism is an offshoot of social realism that focuses on the lives of young working class British men who spend their free time drinking in pubs. Room at the Top by John Brain is a kitchen sink realist novel. Socialist realism. Socialist realism is a type of realism created by Joseph Stalin and adopted by communists. Socialist realism glorifies the struggles of the proletariat. Cement by Fyodor Gladkov is a socialist realist novel. Naturalism. Naturalism is an extreme form of realism influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Naturalism, founded by Emile Zola, explores the belief that science can explore and explain all social and environmental phenomena. A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner is a naturalist short story. Psychological realism. Psychological realism is a type of realism that's character driven, focusing on what motivates them to make certain decisions and why. Psychological realism sometimes uses characters to express commentary on social or political issues. Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky is such one prime example of psychological realism. Thank you very much.